The Greeks and the Romans lived in a world where slavery was a reality, and their philosophies of law and of justice had to reckon with the fact that some individuals were deprived of basic rights, that they lived in a society that was fundamentally unequal, that distributed rights and privileges and honors differentially, and that in fact did so in an extreme way, such that some people were enslaved to others. And we've seen how Aristotle, how Roman law reckoned with this, and how Roman Stoicism is in some ways uncomfortable with the realities of this, but never fundamentally confronts slavery as an injustice that is inflicted on individuals. Let's turn now to Christianity, a religious movement whose ethical teachings would seem to have the resources to criticize slavery as fundamentally unjustified. Indeed, in the modern world, abolitionism, the idea that slavery is fundamentally unjust, has deep roots within Christianity. In the ancient world, already we see that Christianity teaches a gospel that transcends both ethnic and status distinctions. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes that ethnic communities have little moral meaning. The Gospel of Luke teaches that Christianity offers salvation to all, and in a way that renders ethnic obligations obsolete. In similar fashion, just in the way that Paul teaches a version of the Christian gospel that transcends ethnic boundaries, so his gospel explicitly transcends status boundaries. Now, you see this, in fact, in the same passages. For instance, in Galatians, Paul famously says, in Jesus Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, free nor slave, male nor female. That is a radical claim in the ancient world. In Jesus Christ, there is no significance to these sorts of distinctions. Male, female, in a world where gender relations are fundamentally hierarchical. Jew nor Greek, in a world where ethnic communities are profoundly important. Free nor slave, in a world where status distinctions are fundamental. Paul says that there isn't free and slave in Jesus Christ. But what does that mean for a theory of justice? The Christian movement, in its first several centuries, certainly encountered the realities of the Roman slave system. In fact, even in one of the letters that was written by Paul, the letter to Philemon, we see the Roman slave system in its realities. In fact, a slave had fled from his master out of fear and had come to Paul seeking intervention, seeking an advocate who would help restore the relations between the slave and his master. So the Christians confront slavery from the very first days of the religion. And in fact, across the first several centuries of Christianity, we know that the religion included slaves as well as free persons. At the same time, though Christianity held in store the resources which would provide a critique of slavery, in the early centuries, there is very little explicit criticism of slavery as an institution. The Christians would teach that it had no spiritual significance, but Christianity does little to advance even on Stoicism in terms of criticizing the fundamental injustice of slavery. But in part, that's because Christianity is a minority movement. That is, that the Christians are themselves somehow fundamentally outside the mainstream of this society. So there's very little in the early Christian writings that in fact work to justify any social arrangements or even criticize social arrangements. The Christians set up alternative communities about which we often know very little. But that would change in the 4th century AD. The 4th century is a crucial historical turning point because in the year 312, one of the Western emperors of Rome, a man named Constantine, experienced a vision in the sky that he would come to interpret as a message from the Christian God that he was to become a follower of Jesus. And in fact, this individual, Constantine, would change the course of history by adopting Christianity as his personal religion, because now a Roman emperor adhered to the Christian faith, or at least favored the Christian religion. Constantine himself had many events in his life that no one would consider particularly ethical. And in fact, he waited until his deathbed to be baptized, probably in some kind of belief that the conduct of the office of Roman emperor would require behaviors that were, in fact, unchristian. The conversion of Constantine to Christianity didn't mean an immediate Christianization of the Roman government, of the Roman state, of Roman law. In fact, Christian beliefs would be very slow to influence various elements of Roman law. Christianity wasn't equipped, it simply wasn't prepared for an imperial takeover. And in fact, it would be generations before Christianity would truly have fundamental effects on the way that Roman law thought about basic questions of justice. Nevertheless, the conversion of Constantine to Christianity began a process which would see Christianity become, over the next 2 to 3 generations, a mainstream institution. The Christian church would become a majority religion. Christians who'd once been a persecuted minority, setting up communities outside the mainstream, would now become increasingly the mainstream itself. The Christian church would become a powerful institution. This created many paradoxes because Christianity is a religion that teaches utter pacifism, turning the other cheek, but now has to be reconciled with the reality of administration and power and war. And so the 4th century is a period when, for the first time, generations of Christian thinkers and Christian leaders are trying to reconcile the teachings of Jesus with life in the world, with a government, with a state, with being a part of the mainstream of society. And this process of becoming a powerful, wealthy, mainstream institution would also provoke some of the most extraordinary social thought in all of the history of Christianity. So the 4th century is a period of extraordinarily fertile social thinking. And one of the most remarkable artifacts of these generations is a text that comes from the middle of the 4th century that was written by a Christian who was deeply learned in Greek philosophy, who in fact had studied at Athens, who was as learned in the traditions of Plato, of ancient philosophy, as anyone in his age, a man named Gregory of Nyssa. So when you think of Gregory of Nyssa, who's one of the most holy fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church, think of him as a philosopher who's steeped in the traditions of thinking about justice, as a Christian who inherits the gospel legacy, and as a Christian at a particular moment in the generations after the conversion of Constantine, as Christianity becomes a mainstream institution. And part of this process that provokes fundamental thinking about what Christian doctrine means for the practices of society. The 4th homily on the book of Ecclesiastes by Gregory of Nyssa is one of the most remarkable artifacts in the history of political thought. Because in this sermon, which Gregory gives as a homily on Ecclesiastes, the book of the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, Gregory preserves for us in this text the most ancient criticism of slavery as an institution which we have. Now, there were surely others who in various ways had criticized slavery. Probably those who had been enslaved developed some forms of opposition to slavery, certainly as practiced. But these are lost to history, and they may well have been limited. For instance, even the ancient slave revolts that we know about only through other sources, not through the slaves who were revolting themselves, probably didn't aim at abolition, probably didn't aim to overthrow the institution of slavery. They were simply a way of escaping from slavery. Gregory's homily is the oldest surviving text which says, fundamentally, slavery is wrong. And as you read this text, think of it as one outcome of the ethical teachings of Jesus about the nature of justice, a one encounter of Christian doctrine with the realities of the world. This is a text that goes well beyond even Stoic uneasiness with the institution of slavery. Stoicism says that every person has a kind of common dignity, but it's willing to accept legal and institutional forms that exist in this society. Gregory explores an argument in his homily on Ecclesiastes that says slavery is inherently unjust. He says, all humans are created in the image of God. And this is very much a sermon about what that means, that all humans are created in the image of God. Gregory says, not only does this mean that all humans have dignity, but that has institutional ramifications. And that's a remarkable leap, to go from the claim that all humans are created in the image of God and have a certain kind of dignity to seeing that that has ramifications for the order of rights, privileges, and powers in a society. Gregory says that what this means, that all humans are created in the image of God, is that all people have moral reason. All people have the faculty of moral reason. And see how different this is from Aristotle, who says that some people lack the full capacity for moral reason to deserve their freedom. For Gregory, it's essential that all people have the faculty of moral reason, with the consequence that they deserve institutional freedom. Gregory says the way that slavery is practiced is inherently degrading, and it violates the basic dignity of the individual. In fact, he says, how many obols, that's a common Greek coin, how many obols did you pay for the image of God? How can you write up a contract that says that you own another human being? For Gregory, that's fundamentally an injustice. There is no exchange that can justify the individual's enslavement. It fundamentally violates their individual dignity. Now, it's one of the tragedies, one of the sad chapters of history, that this beautiful, brilliant sermon exists and yet seems to have had no consequence. There's never a political movement in Roman law, in Roman politics, to abolish slavery. Gregory's sermon doesn't translate into a political program, and indeed, it seems to have been little noticed and uninfluential. But nevertheless, the arguments that he makes, we can see as one way of reasoning from Christian doctrine to a theory of justice, one that would, 1,000 years later, begin to have an impact in a new world.